Let's see. Yep, okay, I'm on. Thank you very much. So my talk has three parts. In the first part, I'll introduce what I call the paradox of robustness, which is in essence that the better a system is at protecting itself against errors, the more the system's components tend to accumulate errors. And I'll argue that this basic paradox has important consequences for the architecture of evolutionary systems. In the second part of the talk, I'm going to ask the question, why are genomes overwired? By which I mean that genetic regulatory networks in biology often seem to be more deeply and densely connected than one might reasonably expect. And I'll suggest that the paradox of robustness may explain some aspect of this dense wiring in genetic regulatory networks. And in the third part of the talk, I'll ask, what are the consequences of deeply and densely connected genetic regulatory networks? And that will bring us to discuss the relations between genetic regulatory networks, evolutionary dynamics, and learning dynamics in deeply and densely connected neural networks that are common in modern artificial intelligence. So with that background, I'll just jump into the first problem, which is what I call the paradox of robustness. And I'm going to introduce this with an analogy from the history of engineering and computer hard drives, computer hard disks. So if you're old enough to remember 30 years ago or so, computer hard drives were extremely expensive. And most low-end and mid-range computer systems, because hard drives were so expensive, just used a single disk. And that single disk was a point of failure because typically only one copy of the data was stored on the disk, again, because of the great expense. And the disks were engineered to fairly high tolerances to reduce the errors in copying the data and the failure rates of the disks themselves. But as the disks became a bit cheaper over time, people began to use multiple hard drives, even in low-end and mid-range computer systems. And with multiple hard drives, they could store multiple copies of the disk and form some redundancy. And so there then formed a general approach in computer storage known as RAID arrays for redundant arrays of independent disks. And so in essence, what you have is an array of disks. And then above the disks, you have a controller board, a controller logic board, the RAID array controller. And when data come in to be stored, then it comes into the controller board, and the controller board breaks up the data into a lot of little chunks and spreads those chunks of data in a partially redundant array way across the array of disks. And typically, it's not just a copy of the data on one disk and a copy on another disk, but the RAID array uses some complicated algorithm to spread the data out across the disks to maximize performance and minimize costs. And in consequence of having this architecture, then if a computer hard drive fails, it's really usually not much of a problem because the failed hard drive is identified by the RAID array controller, and you pull out the hard drive that's failed and you stick in a new hard drive. And the RAID array controller rebuilds the lost data on the new hard drive with the existing data on the other disks. And so you continue on with no loss of data. And so that's the basic architecture. And so the system has acquired greater protection against errors, we say greater robustness. But in consequence, what people do is they tend to use now very cheap disks in these RAID arrays. And in fact, many people say that RAID stands for redundant arrays of inexpensive disks. The idea being that because a disk failure is really not a problem anymore now that you have this higher level of error correcting control that sits above the system, you use cheap disks to save money because it's not really a problem if a disk fails. And you can actually find discussions of the sort of cheapest disk you can get away with using in these systems. People actually discuss this. And so what we see is a particular architectural change in the system over time. As we get a higher level of error correcting control, first of all, the locus of design and where the money goes to this higher level of control. The RAID array controller boards can be quite expensive. And then at the lower level, the components, which used to be engineered to very high levels of tolerance, are now replaced with cheaper, lower performing components that tend to have a much higher failure rate. And so the what I call the paradox of robustness, although in this example it's very obvious, but what I call the paradox of robustness is that when you have a system acquiring a higher level of error correction and protection against perturbation, it's often quite natural to see the lower level components become more error prone and to see substitution of cheaper, lower performing components within the system over time. So if you were just an evolutionary biologist watching the evolutionary history of this system and you were focused on the individual hard drives as a particular physiological unit, what you might see is that the hard drives actually become a bit flakier and actually seem to be a bit maladapted relative to what could be achieved over time, which would seem puzzling. But in the context of the whole system, it's not very puzzling. Another thing that happens in this sequence is that once you get the migration to higher level control and the decay of the lower level units, you really can't go backwards. You can't just rip off that higher level of control because now the lower level units have such high error rates, the system would perform very poorly. So the paradox of robustness leads to a essentially irreversible ratcheting in the architectural design of the system with a higher layer of control, a decay of lower level units. And I would expect then over evolutionary time that you would get yet a higher level of control that would sit above that. And you would actually then get a decay of what was previously the high level control. Now, I'm arguing that this is a very general principle in evolutionary systems. And what I would like to do now is give you a series of very clear examples from evolutionary biology that support it. But I cannot do that. In fact, I've never found a very good example. And one could reasonably say that maybe I'm acting like Marvin Minsky, which is that I'm making things up about systems. But I think there's a reason why it's difficult to see this sequence in biology. If you think about the way biologists can collect data about natural phenomena, what would it take to find convincing evidence of the paradox of robustness? You would have to see the origin over evolutionary time of a higher level of error correcting controls. Now we think that those exist because we call that homeostasis. You know, our bodies maintain a fairly constant temperature. That was an evolutionary novelty that evolved. So we know that homeostatic error correcting controls do evolve through time, but you would have to see the origin of a higher level of error correcting control. And then you would have to actually observe the sequence by which lower level units, which previously had to be engineered to a higher tolerance, might actually decay and be substituted by cheaper, lower performing components. And we just don't get that kind of sequence in the data from evolutionary biology. First of all, because it's difficult, and secondly, because essentially nobody's ever looked, except for a couple of people. Really, this paradox of robustness isn't something that's widely discussed in biology. But I feel it's a very simple and logical idea, which seems likely to be a general principle about how systems would evolve. And one reason for bringing it up today is that I wonder whether evolutionary computational systems where people work on complex computational models in computers, if they began to look for these sorts of things, you might actually see these sorts of processes evolving. Now, computational systems in the computer often don't have such strong notions of cost and benefit, which are really essential to the notion of substitution of cheaper components. But maybe in the history of robotics, especially artificial life or evolutionary robotics, you might see these things. So I'm just throwing it out as for a way of discussion to see if anybody has any points about that to raise. So that's the first part of the talk. I'll move to the second part of the talk, which is I want to ask the question, as I described it, why are genomes overwired? By which, as I said before, I mean that genetic regulatory networks in biology seem to be more deeply and densely connected than one might reasonably expect. Now, of course, the notion of reasonably expect is more or less hopeless, but we can talk a little bit about some biological facts just to build up some intuition here that would allow us to think a little bit about this problem. And most of you will know this, but I'll just walk through some basic facts about biology, which is, of course, that the genes are encoded in DNA, and the DNA is just a molecule, which is effectively a bit string that contains information. And from the bit string information, the DNA cells make proteins, and proteins are the effectors that do things. Proteins build bodies, proteins make enzymes that influence reactions, and proteins make sensors. So that's the basic structure of organization of genetic regulatory networks. But importantly, one of the things that proteins can do is proteins can feed back and influence the expression of other genes. So basically, you've got DNA makes a protein. That protein then feeds back and influences another part of the DNA, another gene, and influences how much protein is made from that second gene. So now you've got DNA makes protein, protein does something, or protein feeds back onto the DNA and influences the expression of the DNA. And that's the architecture, that's the core architecture of genetic regulatory networks, and it's sufficient and complete, I would think, to actually build very complex organisms. And historically in biology, that's the core unit of the way we think about genetic regulatory networks and genomes. And it's still to this day really the core of the way people think about biological networks. But there's a little more complexity that's been discovered over time. In fact, for many years, going back a long time in molecular biology, people know that actually the DNA, which is a bit string in a molecular bit string, gets transcribed to a second molecule, RNA, which is another molecular bit string, and RNA makes protein. So it's DNA to RNA to protein, which is the central dogma of biology. But once you get that intermediate layer of RNA, now you can have lots of things happen because the RNAs are very reactive. So a gene can make an RNA, that RNA can make a protein, but that RNA can also influence other RNAs. So now you've got a new layer in the system where you can get influence of changes in gene expression and changes in how the network works. And in fact, there's a huge amount of connectivity between different RNAs. And there's different classes of RNAs that function in specific ways in the network. So now you've got DNA makes RNA, RNA influences other RNAs, RNA makes protein, protein can influence RNAs, protein can influence DNA, proteins can modify other proteins. We know all of these things happen. And in fact, there's a variety of other factors, which I'm not going to discuss, which are involved in sort of increasing the density of wiring of the genetic regulatory network in genomes. And also we know that there's a significant amount of depth. DNA makes RNA, makes protein. That protein influences another gene, which makes a protein. And that second protein influences the expression of other genes. So there's a layering of the proteins as they influence DNA expression. This is all sort of the canonical modern understanding of genetic regulatory networks. But I think if you go back 20 years before people recognized the complexity, other modulating factors, they just knew DNA makes RNA, makes protein, protein influences DNA. That sort of was the original view that people, I think, were surprised as they discovered all of these additional layers of wiring. It's a bit like thinking if you had asked an engineer 20 or 30 years ago, make me a simple biological network that does a simple function, then they would make a simply wired regulatory control system on classic control theory principles. And it wouldn't look anything like what real genetic networks look like with this deep, dense architecture. So I think it's been a bit surprising to most people that genetic regulatory networks have this deep and dense connectivity. And that leads to some questions. First of all, how did that evolve? And I think we don't really know. There's a variety of processes. I think one thing that could happen, speculating, is that the paradox of robustness could be important. As you get a higher level of control that sits above the system and protects the system from perturbations, which is obviously a trait which will often be favored by natural selection, that weakens the selective pressure on the lower level units, which will increase the stochasticity, weakens the selective pressure on those units, makes them more neutral selectively, increases the stochasticity in the evolution of these lower layer components. And that's going to lead to some random connectivities, which may have very weak effects. And that as you get, and then you can't go backwards because the paradox of robustness suggests an irreversible ratchet mechanism. And that you might get a second layer of control that sits above the first layer of control. And you can imagine this layering as being a natural evolutionary dynamic that happens over time. Again, I don't have any direct evidence for this from biology, but I think it's really an open question. And I don't know that anybody has a good theory for understanding the evolutionary history of the wiring of genetic regulatory networks. So once again, I want to ask the question about whether this is something where we can see this interplay between what people can see in evolutionary computational systems and the history of robotics and artificial life, and the things that we do and don't know about biology. It seems to me to be a really open area that the time is right to approach. And that brings me to my last topic, which is what are the consequences of deeply and densely connected networks in biology? And the short answer is I don't know. But I want to draw some analogies to recent studies in deep neural networks. And so I'm going to show one slide here. So I need to share. And play. Somehow that didn't seem right. Do you see that slide? Yes? Okay. So, and can you see that pointer? Okay, thank you. So this is a picture from a recent article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences about what was described as one of the great puzzles in modern deep neural networks. Now, this is not my field, so I'm just going to describe my understanding of this and make some comments about it. And then I'm going to leave it open for discussion. And if you need to correct me about many things that I say, that's fine. This is just something I read that I found to be very curious and interesting. And so this is a picture that shows, again, what was described as a puzzle that to be explained about modern deep and dense neural networks. And so this is a diagram of training dynamics, learning dynamics. And so this is a typical deep network problem. You've got a deeply and densely connected neural network, and you're going to train it to do some function, which is generally, to summarize in my naive way, is a input-output problem. You give the system some inputs, and you ask it to output some decision or some statement. And the deep, dense network then matches inputs to outputs. And you have some data, and the data take some observation like pictures or whatever, and maps those observations to some outcome. And these are true mappings. And so this is what you use to train the network. So you start out let's see where we are here. There we go. You start out and initially the network has a high error rate. Oh, I should also say that you do what you typically do in these systems is you take the data that you have and you split it. So part of the data you use to feed into the system to train the system, and part of the data you use to test the system to see how well it's performing, where you have separate training data and test data. So you feed the system the training data through various iterations, and over time the system gets better. That is to say, it reduces its error on the training data set. And because the number of parameters in these deep, dense networks is much greater than the dimensions of the numbers of data, the dimensionality of the data set, you overfit. So you get basically zero error after you train for a while because the system is learning to describe the data with a classic overfitting. Now, when you test this network and how well it performs on your test data set, which is not fed to the model, but is used to test how well the model performs, at first the model is doing better because it's learning something about the problem. But as you begin to overfit and just describe the data, you do worse. And that's the classic overfitting problem. And that's why you're always taught to use the smallest number of parameters that you can when you build a regression. At least you used to be taught that. I don't know what they teach anymore. Because if you overfit, then you describe the data, but then you have a very fragile model that's going to perform poorly on when making predictions for anything that is not in the original data set. So this is just called the classic regime. Classic overfitting, you're seeing the fragility of an overfit model. But the puzzle, and I'm not really an expert in this, nor do I understand it, but the puzzle seems to be that if you continue to feed the data to the model and continue to do gradient descent, you're not really getting much improvement because the error is already quite low. But the network continues to change in its connectivity pattern. And then you get this second phase of training where the test error actually starts to go down. And so that these high-performing neural networks, which of course only work on certain kinds of problems, but nonetheless, when they work, they're fantastic. These high-performing neural networks that we see in modern AI are really a consequence of sort of this overfitting and then overtraining, you might say. And nobody really understands fully why this is so. I mean, it seems to be that the network is beginning to form sub-solutions and beginning to have internal nodes that recognize subcomponents of the particular challenge that are being presented. You can say that the internal system is building a little bit of a semantics or a logic for the problem. People say all of these things. There's no really strong theory that tells us how or why that happens. And so this is really was presented as one of the great challenges in understanding this current phase in modern artificial intelligence, where we're getting high-performing neural networks that are deeply and densely connected. We know that their performance seems to be related to the deep, dense connectivity. We know that these sorts of things happen, but we don't know why. And so this is, again, one of the puzzles. And now I want to go back to my claim that genetic regulatory networks are deeply and densely connected. And so these are things that I'm just throwing out as puzzles. I don't really understand any of this, but since genetic networks seem to be deeply and densely connected, then it sort of leads you to wonder, well, in some sense, of course, the evolutionary dynamics and learning dynamics are really very close. Genomes, which are deeply and densely connected networks, are being trained on nature. And perhaps they're being trained on nature with huge numbers of parameters. There are these big overfit models. But because there's these big overfit models with a deep network architecture, they may be fairly robust when faced with a challenge that's outside of the normal range of natural situations that they've faced. And that perhaps this could have been perhaps this was one of the great major transitions in evolution, which is not really talked about in the classic major transitions, is the deep, dense connectivity in networks that allow, well, some people talk about this. I'm not saying that this is not known, but really we don't understand the dynamics and the process. And so this seems to me to be really a great challenge for people that are interested in evolutionary computation and artificial intelligence and in biology, because what we have are a set of observations that are just thrown up as puzzles in all of these fields that we don't understand, and that looking at them from the different points of view of the different fields seems to me to be likely to be beneficial in trying to make progress in all of these problems. So that's all I have. As you can see, I presented a lot of questions and no answers, because there's just a lot of things about these issues in biology and in modern computational evolutionary studies that I just don't understand. And so I thought today would be a good chance to lay some of those out. And so I'll end by just giving you a quote on the paradox of robustness that really captures the essence of the idea. So you can see the idea has been around for a long